It is Julia Mejia, at-large city councilor in the city of Boston, and I'm here to tell you that because of one vote, yes, one vote, I won my elections, which means if you think your vote doesn't matter, you need to think again.
The winner of House District 94 is Debi.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining. Welcome to our webinar, The Citizen Superhero and the Power of One Vote. I want to thank all of our guests for joining. I think it's going to be a fun conversation here on Valentine's Day. So to kick everything off, let's each introduce ourselves and maybe say one thing that we love about voting to celebrate Valentine's Day. I am Sara Gifford, your host. I'm here from ActiVote. And the thing I love about voting are the I voted stickers. I save them, I enjoy them all year round. Shakira, maybe you can go next.
Yes, my name is Shakira Mills. I'm the Deputy Chief of Staff at Bridge Alliance. One thing I love about voting, it's a wonderful excuse to be doing one thing at a time, right? I can't do anything else because I'm voting.
Excellent. Mila, maybe you can go next.
Hi, I'm Mila Atmos. I'm the host of Future Hindsight, which is a civic engagement podcast. And what I love about voting is that I feel that I'm exercising my power to be a good citizen.
Excellent. Ted.
My name is Ted Getschman. I'm the founder and executive director of Common Sense for United America and maxvoting.org. And I kind of echo what Mila said. I like finding out about all the candidates and feeling that sense of power that it's up to me. I get to make the call. So I really like that.
Thank you. Chuck.
Hi, everyone. Chuck Corra. I'm the Associate Director of Coalitions and Policy Research at Generation Citizen. One thing I love about voting is it just feels so empowering. It's such a cool experience. And when you bring other people in to do it with you, it's even better.
Debbie, last but certainly not least.
Hi, everyone. I'm Debi Lombardi. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the program director for National Voter Registration Day. And I love, a lot of people told personal things, but I love seeing new voters get really excited about voting. That's one of my favorite things. So.
Excellent. Well, we are all here because we love voting and also love inspiring others to do the same thing. In the video that we showed at the beginning, sound maybe didn't work. There are elections all over the country that are decided by a single vote. And if not a single vote, by only a handful of votes. And so, especially when you get into local elections, special elections, every single person's vote matters. When you look at that election space, there are, what many campaigns call super voters that vote in all elections. And then there's, everybody else in between. So maybe to start off today, we are all working in the democracy space, probably also all super voters as we can. So maybe to talk about what inspired each of us to become a super voter. Very quickly, for me, my parents used to take us voting with them when we were kids. It was in the gymnasium of my elementary school. I was a little bit of a geek, even back in like kindergarten, and we weren't allowed to go to school until my parents finished voting. So whether the line was long or the line was short, we would be late to class. Which at the time I thought was like the worst punishment in the world, to be late to school just to go to vote. And now I realize that my parents just taught me an amazing lesson about how important it is. And it's okay to be just a few minutes late if it means you get to exercise that right to vote. So maybe I'd love for everybody to share kind of what inspired you to kind of work in this space and be a super voter yourself.
I can go ahead and kick that off, starting with what inspired me to get into this work, just because of how unique Bridge Alliance is, and that a lot of organizations will have a focus or maybe a side of the spectrum that they tend to fall on, whereas Bridge Alliance is really advocating for everybody's piece of the solution being just as valid. And because I was military, I never grew up in one space. So I have like a lot of life experience of just seeing the value in different, but often conflicting perspectives, but still seeing them all as important to this like multifaceted world that we live in anyway. And so that's what really inspired me to get into the work. What's inspired me to be a super voter, I'll be honest, I didn't become one until I had my daughter 2 years ago. And then that's what inspired me, because it wasn't really advocated for in my neighborhood or encouraged. And so I wanted to start doing that so that she would then normalize it and become a super voter.
I could jump in here a second. We'll keep our order going, but kind of to echo some of what Shakira said, being in the military and seeing a lot of this in the international space, and not everybody has not only just the ability and the right to go out and do the voting, but we, believe it or not, there's a lot less influence or nefarious influence over how we vote and who we vote for. It hasn't always been that way in the history of the United States, but I think certainly it might look dark, but we're in a good period right now where you really can, go out and say, this is what I believe in and this is who I want to vote for. So that's what inspired me. And it was other areas about the voting kind of inspired me to move towards the Common Sense for United America, which dealt with more the fact that it's an all or nothing game on our voting. Like you said, every vote counts, but it's kind of like if your side doesn't win, then everything bad happens. And that's kind of the darker side of all of this. But those are my inspirations.
I'm happy to jump in, and thanks to everybody else for sharing their experience. Mine, I think, mirrors some of y'all's. I had a mom who was very engaged in voting growing up and took me with her when I was a little kid and would explain the process to me and explain who she's voting for and why. And it was a really cool experience. And I always was excited to be able to do that myself. For some reason, she kind of ignited that excitement in me. And so the first opportunity I had to vote, I went and I did it, and it was really cool. And I think like with this work, so I work for Generation Citizen, and for those who don't know, we advocate for comprehensive and high quality civics education for all students. We believe that everyone should have access to it. And one of the reasons that I got involved in this is because I think it's so fundamental to just the strength and healthiness of our democracy to have a full understanding, not just of how our nation was founded, but how things work at a very base level from your local level all the way up to your federal level, and to have an interest in that too, and not be bored by it and not be, annoyed by it, and find like that there's real value in understanding those institutions. And so when the opportunity arose to work for GC, I jumped at it because it's such a unique opportunity, and we are in a very unique time right now in order to be able to kind of, I think, set people on a good course with civics education so that they're more empowered to be active citizens.
So I'll jump in next. Thanks, Chuck. I think what you said there was so powerful. I think a lot of people are not very well versed about how much power they have and how the government actually works. And that was definitely one of the inspirations for me to get into this democracy space, to make sure that people understand how they can actually shape what's happening in the public sphere. And so that's the inspiration behind Future Hindsight. What we do is we talk to people who make a difference, or citizen change makers, we call them, and give people ideas of what they can do beyond voting, but short of running for office. And I became a super voter because I have not been a citizen for a long time. I came to the United States as an exchange student, actually, and I didn't become an American citizen until 20 years later. And towards the end, before I became a citizen, I thought, I'm paying all of these taxes as a green card holder at that time. And I thought, what is this? Taxes without representation. I need to become a citizen. So I did. I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but honestly, I'd been living here at that point for 20 years. And I thought, if only other people would vote this way or that way, or, make their voices heard. And so I have not missed an election since. I have a good story. There was one time, I live in New York City, and we have a closed primary system. And sometimes, or very often, the primary is the big race and the general election is a foregone conclusion. And the primary had already happened. It was the general. And I thought, oh my goodness, it's raining. I really want to go out. And my, at the time, 10-year-old said to me, what, you haven't voted yet today? And I said, I don't know, it's raining really hard. I don't really want to go out now. And he said, well, it's 1 more hour until the polls close. So I put on my rain slicker and my rain boots and I went back out and I voted. And I brought home the sticker.
Wonderful.
I think that the last person. So I really got involved and started voting and got involved in this work because I grew up in a really small town, and similar to what some other folks said, it wasn't until I got to college that I really understood how the voting process worked and how our systems of government works, because my parents never really voted and it wasn't a big thing in my community. And I was like, this is kind of messed up. Why didn't I learn about this in high school? Why did no one talk to me about the voting process? Why isn't this something that, I was exposed to, not just within my family, but within like my education, which I thought was really important. So I started at an internship for Montana Foundation, which is an affiliate of the Alliance for Youth Organizing, a national group. And I worked there for a few years. And one of the first events I worked on was National Voter Registration Day, which makes it feel very full circle that I work on that now. But I worked on their high school program to help engage students in the voting process, because I really thought it would be so valuable to have that be a part of your earlier education instead of something that you only learn if you're exposed to it from family or friends or when you're in college. So that's really what got me involved.
So these are inspiring stories of both what makes each of us a super voter, but also how we're passing that on to those around us and those coming up behind us. If you look, besides that, elections can be decided by very few votes. It's a cyclical system as well, right? When you're the people that vote, you're also the people that elected officials listen to more, because they know that you're the one that's going to show up to get them either reelected or to boot them out of office. And so, your vote doesn't just count on election day; it counts for all those officials who, advocate for you and all of the constituents around you, whether they vote or not. And so, one of the things I always tell people is, does my vote matter? Besides that, it matters in that specific election. Even if the election is a landslide, your vote matters because they're going to be talking to you, and they're going to be asking your opinion, and they're going to be calling and reminding you for the next election. And so that one vote, especially that series of votes, really amplifies themselves over time. What do each of you tell people when people ask, well, does my vote even matter? Or why does my vote matter? How do you answer that question, to inspire others to vote like we do?
I'll go ahead and start and keep the order. This is a pretty loaded question. I'd say it's going to be a loaded question for everyone, because our experiences have been so different. And so from growing up to now, what we tell people is going to be different. And oftentimes, right, with the country we live in, it's often going to be very personal. And I would say that I tell the truth and the whole truth to people when it comes to why it's important to vote. In that we have always had this power, and this is the one thing that sets us apart from other countries, right? We have the ability to elect the people who then govern us. But historically, right, it's been skewed. And so for that, I think people often hear that, or they learn about it later on in their lives, and it discourages them from voting, as opposed to encouraging them to vote and encourage others to vote, right? It's a system, and we have to work it in order for it to work. But because others in the past have tried to break it or corrupt it, it discourages people from voting. So I would say I tell people the truth and the whole truth. And I do it from a perspective of saying, this is why it's important for you to know how this works, and know that your vote is what's going to change these things and prevent these things from happening again.
I think the thing that I would advise people on, or to try to get them to vote more or to more effectively, is just kind of to really fully understand, and this goes back to what you're doing, Sara, an ActiVote, is, do you really know what these people do? What are these positions that you're voting on? What is the role of the city attorney? What is the role of the, University of Regent? And I would say that, there is an economic level to this argument. What is it really worth to the voter to go do this? So I might have actually stayed at home, Mila, in the rain, given the foregone conclusion on that one. But I think oftentimes you have, an individual who's going up for office, or you have a couple of individuals who are going up, but the position, how much impact does it really have on somebody? Is this something that they need to do? But the problem I see is people don't know. They don't know who's coming out. They don't know what the position, how it could impact them. And so it's the first step isn't just even so much, hey, get out there and vote. It's understand who's in this election and understand what it could mean and the impact this could have on your life. And then does it make sense for you to participate and have a voice? And because I think then they start to, oh my gosh, this does matter now. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I would jump in and say, this question's obviously, it's asked a lot. And I think a lot of times people equate it to, like when they ask, does my vote matter? Typically what they're thinking of, am I going to be casting the deciding vote? Or is my vote going to be influential in the outcome or the result of this election? And a lot of times people often think about, the broad, like a presidential election or something like that. But what I like to try to tell people is there's so many elections where a few votes make a huge difference. I used to live in Nashville, Tennessee for a long time, and Metro Council races, which have an enormous influence over the politics and the policies of the city, often come down to a handful of votes. School board elections, which we have seen a renewed resurgence in the interest in those this year, particularly, and last year, those often come down to just a handful of votes. And, this is kind of it's maybe not the best analogy, but I try to liken it to using a seatbelt. You use a seatbelt, it's not going to necessarily be needed every time you get into a car, but it's your form of harm reduction. You get in, you put your seatbelt on. Sometimes it's going to make a huge difference. Sometimes it might not make much of a difference at all. But what matters is you're using it. You're setting a good example for people who observe what you're doing, and you're showing other people like what's a proper way to operate a car. I think the same thing is about voting. Like, you're going to go into a voting booth, especially if you vote in a presidential election or something like that. Your vote is probably not going to be the deciding vote of how a state goes or how an election goes in that respect. But it's important to do it, one, develop a habit, because, and this is something through one of the initiatives that we have at Generation Citizen Vote 16, voting is a habit, and it's something that's really important to establish when you're young. And so by doing that, you can create that habit and be able to, have it be a more normal course for your life. But I think more importantly is there's so many times that I look at this and think, like, so many people fought, shed blood to give me the privilege of voting. And I don't want to let those people down. I don't want to make that look like it wasn't worth it. And there's so many people that want to be able to vote in this country but can't for so many reasons. And I try to remember that too when I go to the voting booth, and I try to tell other people that too. Because just because your vote may not shift the entire outcome of a race doesn't mean it doesn't matter.
Yeah, there's so many things that have already been said here. I would add, which is kind of like a mix between what Ted and Chuck just said, is that, in local and small elections, it matters also to you directly. The outcomes matter to you. So I was recently looking at an election midsummer in Nantucket this last June. It was kind of, obviously off cycle, an election in June. But what was on the ballot were things like, should we buy a new ambulance? Now, Nantucket is a very small community. It has about 17,000 people who live there year round, but only 1,500 people or something like that voted. And so it passed buying a new ambulance. And it also passed to buy another, I think, ventilator. And so those are good things. But what also happened is that they then passed a tax hike to pay for the ambulance and the ventilator. And I think if you knew that that was going to happen, you would show up and vote and prevent potentially or agree and resoundingly give your approval to the tax hike. And I just think that these are issues that affect us, especially on the local level, and it behooves us to show up. But to Ted's point, we need to know what's on the ballot, like who is running for what. And if it's a referendum like this, then, we need to also understand what the repercussions are for voting for these things. And if you don't do it, somebody else will.
I think people made a lot of great points about, yes, your vote does matter, and a lot of recognition that there's a lot of reasons people may think that their vote doesn't matter. But so I'm going to talk a little bit more about if you're a friend and you're someone who votes actively, they say that some of the best ways to encourage other people to vote is by offering support and encouraging them and talking to them, because you can relate to their experiences more actively. So it's called, relational organizing is like the working term for it, but friends and family members can be really influential in helping, their friends and family who don't vote and figuring out not only like the process for voting, which can be difficult as well, which I think we might talk about a little bit later, but also in identifying like why their vote might be important and providing the education pieces about that. And I think, another factor that is oftentimes discourages people to vote is they don't like the candidates, which can be so valid, is you feel like no one really fully represents your interests. And that's going to continue to happen. But by voting for someone that better represents your interests than others, you can still influence what happens in your community and show that your interests matter. So hopefully more candidates that better represent your interests run in the future. So I think that is an important piece of this. And, voting is still one of the best ways to influence the candidates and referendums and issues that are passed locally, statewide, and nationally for folks.
So you all touch on some great points around people needing to know more about what's on the ballot and what these positions do, hearing from friends and family and people that they trust. And that's a perfect kind of segue into what do we think voters need and how can we help them in the voting process? I think information is certainly one of those things. That's what ActiVote does, is try to provide a platform with information about your ballot and about the issues and try to help create informed and confident voters. But I think next to just being informed, I think it's feeling valued. I think if we look at that landscape, most people aren't asked for their vote, right? So we're all super voters. I'm sure that your mailbox and your text messages and your phone blow up, the month before every election. But then we don't hear from those people again for 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, depending on what that cycle is. But that being said, it's nice to be asked, right? Somebody valued me enough to call me and spend money on a mailer and whatnot. And so I think in addition to education and in addition to some of these other things, I think Debi, kind of going off of what you're saying, it's nice to be asked. It's not, even if it's from a friend or a family, right? That they value you taking the time and the energy to participate in this. So I'm curious, what other things do you think, we or the community writ large can provide for voters, to help them, all become super voters?
I have a bit of an optimistic answer in that, surprisingly, we are well on our way to providing more of what's already out there that gives people access to voting. I used to be one of those people that my immediate answer to that question was accessibility. People don't have accessibility. People don't have ways to get to polls, or people don't have a way to take off of work, right, to go and vote, or people who can't necessarily travel at all. Maybe they can't walk or they have handicap, but they still have the ability to vote. And there are now all of these things, mail-in voting. A lot of neighborhoods that I know of will often organize, group carpooling vans to go through neighborhoods and pick up people that can't, get there themselves. I think voting is a national holiday as well, so people can take off of work. So I think that a few years ago, maybe that would have been like my first answer. People don't have access to voting. And so this leads into, well, obviously my vote doesn't matter if no one cares to put these things in place to give me the ability to go and vote. I just think that we need a little more time to give these things time to spread and be put into effect into neighborhoods that need them the most. And then maybe a few years from now or a couple of decades from now, we won't have this conversation about what do voters need to get to the polls and be encouraged to vote. It will be, how can we keep this going? Or maybe the conversation would just be about encouragement or lowering the voting age or just getting straight to youth. But I do think at this point, we are well on our way to, or at least I see a lot of genuine efforts being put into place to get people to have access to voting.
Some of the things that Shakira was saying, obviously, I would echo that, and what you talked about too, Sarah. There are some main things that we just have to have, and that's an understanding of what the elections are, what are the positions that are involved. So there's that understanding piece. I think ease to the ballot, as far as it's easy access, it's simple, but it's also secure. People need to trust that these methods are actually producing the right result. So it needs to be transparent. And then there's education in understanding, in my community, in my little world, what are the elected positions, and what impact do those individuals have over my life? And then, what are the issues that are coming up? I mean, those are the core things. And you never just have, very rarely do you have an election for like one position or one thing. But I guess that's where I might break beyond that from the panel, from the idea of a super voter. For me, it would just be ensuring that everybody had this knowledge, had this education, had this access, but then it's up to them what they want to do with it. Because I think the time when we get the largest voter turnout is when we are dealing with, high risk, very extreme situations where either everything's going to go my way or everything's going to be, going to go bad. So there's a lot of stake in the game for the individual voter. So it matters so much. And I think when we're pushed to that level, then when you don't win, when your side doesn't happen to come through, then that's when you start seeing the large marches, you see the insurrections, the riots, the whatever, following on that. I think actually in probably my perfect world for an election, you would actually not have an exceedingly large turnout because you would have a series of representatives who represent the majority opinion of the voters. They've done their research. It's not their opinion they're supporting or a party's opinion they're supporting, but the majority opinion of the voters. And they're all outstanding candidates. And so now you're thinking, well, what's the difference between them? I mean, you get into, okay, gender or race or ethnicity or background or professional experience or how effective you think someone's going to be. But resolving for those things, I think you could find yourself in a position where you're like, hey, I'm happy that any of these individuals, can be elected. So I think that the big things are the education and the access and the understanding of what's going on. But I wouldn't actually, stake too high on, well, let's make sure we have the highest possible voter turnout that we could have. And I'll shut up there.
Yeah, I guess I don't have a ton to add to this. I think all the points made were extremely valid and kind of reflect my viewpoint. I guess what I would say is one thing that I've noticed is there's a lot of apathy, I think, across the board with voting in general. And there's so many hoops that you have to jump through, even just to vote. Like, I mean, taking off work, for example, for a lot of people, finding a way to the polls, those are all practical things, but just the apathy in general, at least in my experience, I've seen as a problem because a lot of people don't know a lot about what the different roles that they're voting on does, and they just don't know much about like why does it matter? Why should I go and care about this? And I think, or like it doesn't matter because all politicians are corrupt or something like that. I hear that a lot, and so I think communicating about what government does and what those particular people in those positions do, and how much is affected just by a county assessor or something, for example, or a state legislator, and getting to know and understand those positions and those people, I think is important. And that's a collective effort, not just on activists, but on lawmakers, on public officials to be able to do that as well. So it's something that's like, there's not a clear answer to me for it, but there are a lot of different factors that lead into that. It's so easy just to, I mean, especially when it's raining, just to like say, I don't really feel like going out and voting today. And so it's hard to get somebody to yes like that, but there's a ton of different factors.
So I think to everyone's point here, there's a lot of good election reform happening in terms of trying to get a national holiday and making voting more accessible in different ways to combat gerrymandering and things like this. Having said that, I definitely firmly believe that high voter turnout will render the most representative government we could have. And I think to make voting a habit, I think relies on the education of the voter, which has also been mentioned here a lot. And 20 years ago, there was very robust civics education in public schools, all the way from lower school to upper school. And now in some places, it's not taught at all, or in some places, like I live in New York State, I think the requirement is one semester, your second semester of your senior year in high school, which is really an unideal time to learn about civics or about how your government works. And I think the degradation, the decline of teaching civics correlates also with voter turnout of older populations, right? Like I think older people know how the government works, and so they are more compelled to vote because they know what's going to happen with their vote. And I think young people very often don't do that. Also, young people are often told, oh, young people don't turn out to vote. So if you're a young person rather, and you hear that, then you're just gonna buy that. It's like, oh, I'm a young person, I guess I don't vote. Like that actually, I think that actually happens when they say, that's my demographic and that's what we do. So I think there are so many things we could be doing, but certainly better civics education is one, making voting yet more accessible is another. And I think we should talk to all of our friends and family about the power that we have when we do go out and vote. And, to say things like, when we go out and vote, then we can have these kinds of policies because the candidate that I support supports these kinds of things. For example, even with Biden, you could say, and I know that this is maybe not a great example, but I think it's universal in its appeal because it literally halved childhood poverty last year or 2 years ago when he passed it. And you can say, look, people came out and they voted for this person. And one of the results is that we had child tax credits. And that's universally popular for everybody. And so when you go out and vote again, these are some policies that you could be voting for with these candidates.
Yeah, I definitely agree that the more people that are able to vote and do vote is how we're going to find the most representative democracy. And I think one of the things we talk about there, we've talked a little bit about how access is improving, which is great. And in some ways it definitely has, and in others it hasn't in 2020 because we needed to increase access to mail balloting because of the pandemic. A lot of states put that into place, and then some of them shut them back down and put other laws into place to try and make it more difficult for people to vote, or because they thought it was important for their state. And that every time a voting law changes, it complicates the process for the voter. And there's a thing that came out a few years ago from the Center for Civic Design that talks about the epic journey of American voters, that talks about, the expected path. They register to vote, they learn about what's on the ballot and their options for voting, and then they go and cast a ballot. And it's, that's what we think of, and those are the key ingredients of being able to vote. But along the way, maybe they register to vote, but they didn't have their ID on hand and they have to follow up with their ID. Or a common thing I saw when I was registering voters, they put their birth date in the wrong place and the date for that day in that place, right? So like small things can stop someone from actually being registered to vote. And other things like they may think that they can vote by mail, but they request their ballot too late, and or maybe the post office has an issue, or there's so many things outside of the voter's control that influence this as well. And I think one of the things that we can do is continue to provide that information and encourage people to follow up. But also there's organizations like ours and organizations that support specific communities in helping to register to vote, like National Disability Rights Network does a lot of advocacy for the disability community and making sure access is available. So if you are a voter looking for information, there's probably a group out there that has answers to the questions that you have. And there's a lot of people out there trying to support you. So I think the one thing I have for that is, you may face a challenge, and that happens with voting, but there's always someone there who can assist you in getting to the next step. And hopefully, us and these other groups are actually able to help you do that and able to answer that. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, I think all of these are amazing ideas. And when you look at increasing turnout, in all of these elections and empowering voters, because I do believe voting is an empowering feeling that comes with that. People sometimes ask, where's the easy button? And I don't necessarily even love the question, because I don't think there is an easy button to democracy. And I also don't think it's supposed to be easy. I think it's supposed to be something that we participate in and that we work for, and that we therefore kind of all benefit from. If you look at these types of things, if you look at what are the things that some of us can do, right? If you're listening to this webinar and Mila, to your point in your podcast, it's not just about running for office, right? Sometimes the steps we ask people to take are just a step too far, right? What are the small things that we can do? And when I think about that easy button, well, one of the easy things each of us can do is, when elections come around, talk to your neighbor, talk to your aunt, your uncle, 2 or 3 people kind of around you. If every voter talked to 3 or 4 people every election, turnout would explode. So maybe there isn't an easy button for democracy, but I think it can be an easy button to reaching some of those people, because I'm sure we all have people in our life that are not, willing or able to get to the polls. So kind of curious for everybody else, from your perspective, maybe it's the easy button, or what are the easy things people can do when they want to either participate themselves or, get others to do the same.
I'm not sure that there is one, because of, and this just may be how I think, I walk in an understanding of nuance with everything. And so when I think about what I can do to, encourage people in this way, it really is going to depend on the person and how much I know about them. We can often say things like, yes, go and speak to your neighbors, or put some effort into walking around in your community and encouraging others to go and have the same enthusiasm for voting as you do. But our backgrounds are different. Our reasons for not being able to or choosing not to vote are completely different. So I would say, honestly, these types of efforts start even before voting, for voting season commences. Having relationships with people that are non-political, that have nothing to do with how we skew on the spectrum, is really going to be the key to building trust within each other as a society, so that when it comes time for voting, we can then trust the words of our neighbor or someone that lives in our community that may already know our background and isn't just speaking from the perspective of an organization that they're working with, or a campaign that they're trying to run. We've had prior relationships, and so or prior engagements. And so when someone is trying to tell me why something is relevant to me, I know they're not just speaking to me as a representative of an ideology. They're speaking to me because they know that it's going to personally be relatable to me, or it's specifically going to help me, if that makes any sense. So relationships would probably be it, but making sure that they start from a personal standpoint, a humane standpoint, and not just a political one.
Yeah, I have to echo what Shakira said. Just you trust the people you know more so than something you see on television or a campaign that you're hearing from. And really what we ideally all want is for everybody to go out and vote who they are. We all took our own path through life, and we all have developed our own understanding and viewpoints of all these very complicated issues. And we want to hear everybody's viewpoint, whether they agree with us or not. It turns into a football game with this whole, red versus blue, Republican versus Democrat, who's going to win kind of nonsense. But what it really kind of needs to be is an expression of all of us, all of our voices kind of coming together to give sort of a common direction. And I think it's nurturing not those relationships, but ensuring that part of your relationship with your friends is that we go vote, even when we don't agree, we all go vote, we all participate, that this is just something that we do, that is part of who we are and our culture. So my easy button for that is making that part of your group or your clique or your team, that's what we do, is we go and vote, even if we're on completely different pages, maybe even more so. Let's all go and say who we are and what we believe in. Over.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all that. One thing I would add is I think there's an enormous power in positive social pressure. FOMO, fear of missing out. I think when more people post about voting on social media and things like that, it really does have an effect on people because they don't want to be the person that people think isn't voting because it's not a popular thing to be known as someone that doesn't go and vote, at least in my experience. And so I think there's some power and positive social pressures of like showing. It's kind of like, it's very similar to when people would post pictures of their vaccination card. Obviously, that was a little bit more political or got political, I guess, after a while, and sort of derailed from there. But I think the point being is that when more people see it, they realize, oh, all these other people are doing this. I should go do this as well. I should share that I'm doing this as well. I think that that's one thing. Obviously, it's not something that's going to solve like voter turnout issues, but I do think that there's some value in that because it creates an incentive for somebody to go and do something. They don't want to be the person that's not doing that. They don't want to be missing out on that, and so it's utilizing social media in a way that can actually be effective rather than be a disincentive to voting. So that's one thing that I've noticed. It's sort of a unique thing that I think is has cropped up and that could be powerful.
Yeah, for sure. Messaging around missing out that everybody else is doing it and you're not doing it too is, I think, very powerful. I would agree with Shakira and Ted that there's nothing really easy here, and building relationships and being the kind of person who is open to talking with your friends and family who might disagree with you on the political spectrum is actually really challenging. And like Shakira said, you have to do it all the time, like well before you have to go and vote. And I think that's just a muscle that we have to train ourselves to have, to be comfortable in having maybe uncomfortable conversations with people who disagree and really talk about how our vote really does matter. I think that's maybe way more important than than talking about what your politics are. Obviously, that's but to say that here we are, we can be empowered. In fact, I think that's one of my favorite things about this country is that in fact the infrastructure to exercise our vote almost everywhere is pretty sound. And there have been attempts to make it less sound, and there has been a lot of voter apathy, which is what we have been talking about. But yeah, to have these trusted relationships is incredibly meaningful, and to talk about the power that we have.
Yeah, I think also just going to say super agree with Shakira about how important it is to have relationships with the people that you're talking to about voting. And there's a lot of evidence that this like gear up really big right before the election and then disappear after is not an effective way to get people excited about the process and to help long-term voters. And Circle, who actually is a research organization that actually focuses on K through 12, one of the big things that they put out a couple of years ago is that they are focusing on growing voters instead of mobilizing voters, which means investing in young people and like what speaks to them long term and why that's an important way to make sure that they're able to vote. And part of that was identifying that for a lot of younger people, issues are at the center of what is motivating for them. And so centering that in a lot of the conversations. And that varies for different people. That's just one example. But I think one way, that's not an easy button, but is a way to think about voting and talk about it is, our method is through a holiday like National Voter Registration Day, which is to make an opportunity nationally to like celebrate democracy and like raise awareness about voter registration deadlines are coming up and make it a fun activity to apply some of this like social pressure that people were talking about because it's all over social media. Like, even in a local election, we were trending #1 on Twitter, which is like not, a little bit of bragging, but also I think speaks to the fact that like this kind of thing can really bring awareness. So holidays like that and other efforts can be really helpful.
This was absolutely excellent. And I think it bleeds kind of nicely into kind of hopefully our wrap up. When people turn on the news or read the paper these days, they probably see a lot of headlines that are meant to scare you or anger you, right? You better vote because something really bad is going to happen, or something really bad is happening, so you better go vote. And there's an old quote that most people don't hate government, they hate politics. And the problem is people don't know which is which anymore. And I think, maybe to wrap this up, if everyone can kind of state their positive way of encouraging participation, so less the scare tactic and more the positive. I think for me, one of the big things is how many times, in your average year, does someone just want your opinion? And you get to have whatever opinion you want, and it's yours. And they need it. They need you to have that opinion. So, you can ask about the Super Bowl halftime show, you can ask about any other thing, but in this case, there's an entire kind of ecosystem out there that is just looking for your voice and your opinion. And that's kind of, for me, one of the positive ways. So, yeah, kind of last time around, I would love to kind of hear from everybody, their positive ways of encouraging either for you or for your organization.
I think, and as maybe not as positive as this sounds, people love finding ways to work a system. I think over time we have, or at least when I speak to youth, being able to finesse a system is incredible, and they love to be able to do it. And so to explain in that way that collectively, right? Because it takes all of us. So saying that like my one vote doesn't matter, yes, but if you and a bunch of other people think this way, then collectively, no one will vote, and then nothing will get decided upon. So I think encouraging and explaining maybe in a micro type of way that, like, if you and a bunch of other people decide to go out and share your opinions, this massive thing, this massive change can happen. Trying to explain what we've been able to witness over time in a few sentences to people who haven't done it yet, because my angle is always going to be to go to youth. I think that we as older citizens are not necessarily set in our ways we can change, but if we want to look to changing voter turnout and just how elections go in the future, I say getting to the youth is the best place, and explaining it to them in this positive way of the system will work if you work it. That's probably your best bet to getting the youth encouraged in voting, explaining to them that getting out there and voting, using your resources as well. There's no shame in going to vote and then maybe looking up on your phone what something means, or like, how does this apply to me? Or what is this person actually trying to do? I don't remember. You know what I mean? Do it. If that means that you're going to vote not only accurately according to your interests, but accurately according to what's being asked of you, do it. Encouraging them and just explaining that it's a system that can work if you work it, they will go and vote. I promise you.
My positive message would be, it's not so much your vote, it's your voice. And you can be communicating out there with the public. You could be doing podcasts, you could be doing speeches, but at the end of the day, your voice is heard through your vote. And we need to hear your voice. We need to hear everybody's voices coming through loud and clear. And that is your opportunity to do it. And we need it. It doesn't work when there's just a few voices. We need as many as we can have and as many as we can hear.
I always try to identify like what are the things that impact someone's life, and try to help them build that bridge to how voting changes that, or how voting affects that. I think, I've worked on a lot of campaigns before. I worked on a lot of elections, and one thing that matters most is you find that thing that changes somebody's perspective about something, or they didn't realize that, like, oh, this person or this thing affects this particular thing that I care about. A great example is a school bond levy or something, things like that, where it's like, oh, you realize like your child's school was upgraded to where they don't have these dilapidated stairs anymore where people were falling down or getting hurt or something. Well, the bond levy is what paid for that, and people went and they voted for that. It comes down to things like that for me. And I have found that to be the most effective way to get people to the polls and to really value voting, because you do that once with someone, and it's not just one time that they go to the polls. My like in my experience, that type of investment, even if they don't feel that personal connection every time, they understand that things that they may not even know about could be impacted by this election, by this person, by this thing. And so I think a lot of it is that, and that's part voter education, but it's also just part like communicating with people. I, for example, like when I was, turning 18, I didn't know half of what the local elections in my town did. I did not know what a property assessor did. I did not know what the school board, in fact, did. And so helping people understand like how important those positions are and how they affect their daily lives, in my experience, has been the most effective, and also creates an incentive to vote again. And I think to Shakira's point earlier, focusing on young people is extremely important. One thing, and I mentioned before, Vote 16 is an initiative that we work on at Generation Citizen. What we found, and research has showed, that when a teenager is living at home and is eligible to vote, that makes their parents more likely to vote. So you see your child voting, you don't want to be the people, you don't want to be the parents that are not voting as well. And so I think like empowering a new generation to feel the value in voting and to be invested in that will have that trickle up effect, and I think can make a huge difference.
So I agree with everything that's already been said, and I feel like I have to add something slightly different. And I think the only thing I can offer here is that I have an 18-year-old who he just turned 18 last month in January, so it's very exciting. And for his birthday, I gave him a voter registration card, so he was super excited about that. And I think it's good to encourage people who are young to vote, because actually they're very excited to. I have discovered from my son that all of his friends are deeply interested about what's happening in the government. And I think it's really a missed opportunity to not get them to start voting as soon as possible, as soon as they turn 18, because as we all have already discussed here, that voting is habitual. It's a lifelong habit, right? Like once you start voting, you're likely to vote again and again. And so I think what's really exciting is to share with people that young people are interested. They do want to know what's happening. I think if you look at the activism, for example, when it comes to the climate crisis, you can see that they really want to figure out how they can solve this problem, because we're not solving it right now. So it's going to be up to them. And I think getting them to vote is the first step.
I love everything everyone said. It's hard to go last. I think I'll just add a little bit different thing. I touched on this a little bit in our last one, but I think there is like merit to trying to make some of these things that you do fun and engaging and community oriented, which, that's what National Voter Registration Day does. But there's also other holidays that do that, like Voterly Day, National Voter Education Week, a lot of points where you can do this. And a couple of weeks ago, we interviewed Asian Community Development Council that's based in Nevada, and they did a couple things. They had a petting zoo that had goats, and they had Pokemon Go to the polls, and they were specifically thinking about the young people in their community and what they would like, and put an event together that would fit those interests. And I think these kind of holidays and touch points where like encouraging everyone to go and register and vote on that day or things like that can be really helpful in like creating a moment, and also an opportunity for you to engage folks in your community around an activity that they find particularly interesting, and also add in the voting piece of it as well. So I think that's just an opportunity to kind of create some community around voting and a culture of voting as well.
This has been amazing. Thank you to the Democracy Group for putting this panel together. Thank you to all of you for sharing your time and your wisdom and your positive ideas around voting and participation with everybody here today. And hey, it's 2022. It's an election year, which means that people around us everywhere will have many opportunities, at least two most likely, to vote this year in their primary and their general. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time. Look forward to talking to you soon.